Hello student, welcome all of you to massive open online course on Indian economy. Today we are going to discuss on the empirical facts of inequality in India. After completing this module, you are able to learn the extent of income inequality in India, the extent of wealth inequality in India, as well as their long run trends, that is the trends of income inequality and wealth inequality in India. The present module consists with 7 sections. Section 1 introduces different measures of inequality, and section 2, section 3, section 4, section 5 and section 6 are actually different measures of inequality, where I will explore the empirical facts of inequality that was reported by different group of researchers or different organization. In section 2, I will discuss the facts of inequality measured by World Inequality Report 2022. In their earlier work, Lucas Chanel and Thomas Piketty, they also developed status of inequality in our country, which was published in 2017. I will also explore the empirical facts, important features of inequality following this report, and I will also share the extent of inequality that was made by the Forbes Indian Rich List. And side by side, two important measures of inequality, that is Gini index and Palma index. What is the extent of inequality following these two measurements of inequality. And finally, section 7 concludes the measurement of the inequality. Actually, inequality is the major concern in our country. Since independence, the growth of India, the economic growth of India is spectacular in our country. But side by side, there was the evidence of increase of massive inequality in our country. Therefore, to understand this extent of inequality in our country, here we considered different important measurement. They actually explored the status of inequality or extent of inequality in our country. Among these different measurements, here we have considered 5 important measures to understand the extent of inequality. First one is the World Inequality Report 2022, which was made by Chancel and Piketty. In their earlier work in 2017, they have also published another report regarding the status of inequality in India. We will also consider this report to explore the extent of inequality. Side by side, the measurement of Gini index and measurement of the Palma index, they also help us to understand the extent of inequality. To understand the extent of inequality, first we considered the World Inequality Report 2022. Actually, this is the flagship program or flagship report of World Inequality Laboratory. This World Inequality Lab was headed by the Lucas Chancel and also coordinated by Thomas Piketty and others. They made an attempt to articulate the extent of inequality for different countries in the world, and in their report they able to measure the extent of inequality across different countries like India. If we consider the scenario of the inequality in the world, first we consider the world scenario of inequality, then we will discuss the extent of inequality or the nature of inequality or the trend of inequality in our country, that is in India. In their report, Chancel and Piketty in 2022, they have articulated the extent of inequality in the globe, where they pointed out that the richest 10% of the global population currently takes 52% of the global income, whereas the poorest half of the population earns 8.5% of it, What is the extent of inequality? The top 10% of the global population earns 52% of income, whereas the bottom 50% of the population earns only 8.5% of the total income of the globe. If you consider wealth inequality, then wealth inequality also larger, also higher compared to the income inequality. If you consider the wealth inequality, then according to this report, they argued that the poorest 50% of the global population own just 2% of the total wealth. That is 50% of the population only acquire 2% of the total wealth of the globe. Whereas the richest 10% of the global population own 76% of wealth. What is the extent of inequality? This extent of inequality really surprises us. If you consider the facts that 10% of the global population, rich population, they own 76% of the total wealth, whereas 50% of the bottom population, they only own 2% of the total wealth. Now we come to the extent of inequality in India. By observing the nature of inequality in our country, Thomas Piketty and Chancel, they argued that it is actually the extreme nature of inequality in India. That is the nature of inequality they have articulated for India is termed as extreme income inequalities. And they here pointed out some empirical facts. First off, they pointed out the average annual income of Indian adult population is 2,04,200. But if we consider this average income for different segments of the people, for particularly bottom 50% of the people, their income was 53,610. Whereas top 10% people, that is rich 10% people, their average income was 20 times higher than the average income of the bottom 50% people, and their income was 11,66,520. If you consider top 10 and top 1% rich people, then they actually hold 57% and 22% of the total national income. That is 1% of richest people holds 22% of the total income, whereas the bottom 50% share has gone down to 13%. And by observing the nature of inequality or extent of inequality, they argued that India stands out as a poor and very unequal country with an affluent elite. They have also articulated the long-term trend of the inequality, that is the historical trend of inequality starting from British colonial period to the current situation. And they argued that during the period 1958 to 1947, that is during the British colonial rule, 10% of the top population earned 50% of the total income. But after independence, during the planning period, due to implementation of the socialistic view of the society, this extent of inequality was gradually decreasing up to 1980s. And after 1980s, again, the extent of inequality was accelerated in our economy due to the introduction of the liberalization and the globalization elements in the economy. This figure shows the historical trend of income inequality. Here they considered the top 10% as well as bottom 50% income share. The red line indicates the trend of income share of the top 10% people, whereas the blue line indicates the trend of the income share of the bottom 50% people. If you consider the trend of the income share of the top 10% people, then it was more than 50% in 1900. And after that, it gradually decreases and it reaches as minimum as 30% in the mid-1980s. But after that, it was gradually increasing again, and it increased to 57% during the recent years. That is, the income share of the top 10% increased or accelerated after 1990s, and it came to the 57% in 2021. But if you consider the movement or trend of the income share of the bottom 50%, then it was nearly 15% in 1900, which increased to nearly 20% or slightly higher than 20% in mid 1990s. After that, it gradually declined to 13% in 2021. That is just opposite movement of the income share of top 10% people and bottom 50% people. But from this trend, it is clear that the income share of top 10% people showing the declining trend up to 1980s or up to mid 1990s, whereas the trend of bottom 50 was showing the upward trend up to 1990s. After that, their trend are diverging each other. Therefore, this movement is treated as the scissors-like movement. Now, if you consider the movement of the or trend of the distribution of the wealth, they considered the share of the wealth of top 10% people as well as share of the wealth of the bottom 50% of the people. In this figure, the red line indicates the trend of the share of income of the top 10% people, and the blue line indicates the trends of the share of the wealth of bottom 50% of the people. In 1995, the top 10% people in our country own nearly 55% of the total wealth, and year after year, this concentration of wealth was gradually increasing, and in the latest year, in 2021, it was more than 60%. It was more than 60%, and it is nearly 65%. Whereas in case of bottom 50%, their share of total wealth was nearly 10% in 1995, which gradually declined thereafter, and it came to the 8% or 7% in 2021. That is, that bottom 50% own only less than 10% of the total share of the wealth, whereas top 10% own more than 55% share of the wealth in our country during the period 1995 to 2021. If we consider the scenario of the distribution of income and wealth for a very recent years, that is for the year 2022. In this table help us to understand the extent of inequality for the current year, that is for the year 2022. To describe the extent of inequality, here we classify the population into 4 different groups: bottom 50 groups, middle 40 groups, top 10, that is rich 10% people, and top 1%, that is the richest 1% of the population. And this is the distribution of the income in respect of the different groups of the people. This table also indicates the distribution of income, distribution of wealth in respect of the different group of the people. If you consider the income share across the different groups of the people, then bottom 50% of the people acquires only 13% of the total income, whereas top 10% people acquires 57.1% of the total income. If you consider top 1%, that is richest 1% people in our country, then they acquire 21.7% of the total income. If you consider wealth inequality, then wealth inequality is larger compared to the income inequality. Bottom 50% people only own 5.9% of the total wealth, whereas their income share was 13.1%. In case of top 10% and top 1% people, Top 10% people own 65 nearly 65% of total wealth in our country, whereas top 1% people own 33% of the total wealth in our country. If you consider the ratio of the top 10% to bottom 50% of income, then we can say that the income of the average income of the top 10% people is 20 times higher than the average income of the bottom 50% people. This is the huge inequality that we have experienced in our country, both in respect of income inequality as well as in respect of the wealth inequality. Now we consider another study of Chancel and Piketty to understand the extent of inequality in our country. Actually, they prepared a separate study to understand the extent of inequality in India, and it was published in the year 2017, and the title of this study is Indian Income Inequality 1922 to 2014 from British Raj to Billionaire Raj. That is, by the heading of From British Raj to Billionaire Raj, Lucas Chancel and Thomas Piketty are able to understand the extent of inequality for a very long period in our country, that is for the period 1922 to 2014. And their observation was quite similar with the earlier observation that I have already discussed following the World Inequality Report 2022. The World Inequality Report 2022 was also published by the Lucas Chancel and Thomas Piketty. But this report was their earlier study. The recent study is the World Inequality Report 2022. In their report, that is in the report of 2017, which entitled From British Raj to Billionaire Raj, they found that the extent of inequality was quite high during the pre-independence period, during the British period. But after independence, it was gradually declining up to 1980s, and again after 1980s, the extent of inequalities was again gradually increasing, and during the 2014, their report was up to 2014, this particular report 2017, and in the 2014 the extent of inequality was quite similar as it was observed in 1922. And they found that the contribution of the growth, if we consider economic growth means addition of the total income. That is, then who contributes this addition of the total income? They articulated that the top 1% people in our country, that is the top richest 1% people in our country, captured 29% of the growth of our country. What is the addition of income in our economy during 1980s to 2004? 29% of the additional income captured by richest 1% people. This is the extent of inequality in our country that was observed by Chancel and Piketty in their report in 2017. Now we consider another report which is called Forbes Indian Rich List. Forbes is an American business journal. They articulated they prepared the rich list, top 10 rich person and top 100 rich person across different countries. And they have also prepared the top 10 richest people in our country as well as top 100 richest person in our country. If you consider the share of income of these 10 richest people or 100 richest people, then we can say that is observed in their report. In 1990s, this amount was less than 2% of total national income. That is, the richest person, 100 richest person in our country amounted less than 2% of the total national income in 1990s. But this share gradually increases after 2000 and reaching 10% in 2015, with a peak of 27% in 2008-9 during the year of financial crisis. That is, after 2000, the share of income of the top 100 richest person in our country increased gradually, and during the year 2015, it was nearly 10%. Along with this report, here we considered two important measurements of the inequality. One is Gini index and another is the Palmer ratio. The Gini index is based on the data published by National Sample Survey Organization in our country. National Sample Survey Organization, they publish data in frequent time interval. Their survey is called Consumption Expenditure Survey. This particular survey help us to measure the Gini index or Gini coefficient, and they published the Consumption Expenditure Survey in the year 1977-78, thereafter 1983, then 1987-88, and 1993-94, 2004-5, 2009-10, and 2011-12. After 2011-12, there was no survey relating to household consumption expenditure by the National Sample Survey Organization. Therefore, on the basis of this data, we are able to explore the trends of inequality following the Gini index for the period 1977-78 to 2011-12. And if you consider the particular year 1977-78, then the value of the Gini index was 33.3%. which decreased to 32.1% in 1983 and increased thereafter to 32.6% in 1987 and 88. Again, it declined to 31.7% in 93-94. But after 93-94, it gradually increased to 34.4% in 2004-5, 35.4% in 2009-10, and 35.7% in 2011-12. There was no signal of declining of the trend of the Gini index, and this Gini index gradually increased year after year after 1993-94. That is, after the introduction of the new economic policy in our country, the inequality, the extent of inequality that was observed by the Gini index was gradually increasing. Now we consider another measurement of the inequality, which is called Palmer ratio. Palmer ratio is actually the ratio of the average income of the top 10% people to the average income of the bottom 40% people. That is, it is actually the ratio of the average income of the top 10% people divided by the average income of the bottom 50% of the people. And here this picture shows the trend of Palmer ratio in India for the period 1950 to 2019, for a very long period, starting from 1950 to 2019. And in 1950, the Palmer ratio in our country was 3.5. That means if you consider the average income of the top 10% people and average income of the bottom 40% people, then the average income of the top 10% people was 3.5 times higher than the average income of the bottom 40% of the people, and which reduced to 2.5 in 1989. And in 1980s, it started increase, and this ratio again increased to 3.5 in 2019, as it was in the year 1950. That is, this ratio, the trend of this ratio indicate that during the entire period, the inequality was quite high as it was observed by the Palmer ratio. We have discussed the extent as well as trend of income inequality and wealth inequality in our country on the basis of different reports, that is World Inequality Report, report by Chancel and Piketty, Forbes report, as well as two important measures of inequality, Gini index and the Palmer ratio. On the basis of the empirical facts relating to the extent of inequality, it is clear that the inequality is very high in our country, and this inequality was gradually increasing after 1980s, after the introduction of the liberalization and privatization policy in our country. This inequality was gradually increasing. And side by side, it is also true that wealth inequality is also higher compared to the income inequality. This is the serious concern in our country, because wealth inequality further uh, introduces the income inequality. Wealth is the basis of the income, therefore higher wealth inequality implies higher income inequality in the future. And by observing the extent of inequality in our country, the World Inequality Report 2022, they pointed out that the inequality that observed in our country, it is not inevitable. Actually, it is a political choice. And the two Nobel laureate economists, Abhijit Banerjee and Esther Duflo, they also they also concerned about the nature of inequality and extent of inequality in our country, and they observed that to control the inequality or to curb the inequality in our country, they emphasized on the redistributive public policy, and they emphasized on the increase of the tax collection and effective redistribution of income among the bottom groups of the people, among the poor people. Otherwise, there is no alternative. And accordingly, in our country, Government of India has introduced several programs to control the inequality. But year after year, after 1980s or specifically after 93-94, we observed that there was no signal of declining this inequality. Inequality was gradually increasing year after year. Therefore, this inequality is a serious concern in our country. Effective policy implementation is inevitable to control the inequality in our country.